Okay, class, welcome to our second lecture, online lecture. This is New President, New Deal from 1933 to 1940. Remember, if you need time to write more notes, just pause the video, and then when you're ready to get to the next information, go ahead and press play again. Looks like a lot of you did really great on the quiz, which is fantastic. We're probably going to have our quiz over this one on Tuesday. I'll go ahead and post up the review on Sunday. And on Tuesday I'll also post up our next review where we get into World War II. Alright, so basically this is Franklin Delano Roosevelt and what he's going to do to address the economic problem of the Great Depression. Now the first thing we're going to look at, getting ready to change slides, is the first 100 days. Now, what's so special about the first 100 days? Well, the first 100 days of somebody's presidency is when they try to establish what they want to do with their presidency, and basically the remainder of their term is either expanding on what they were able to achieve or preventing others from diminishing their accomplishments. So what did Franklin Delano Roosevelt do? Well, guys, getting ready to go to the next slide. Things were pretty bad during his lame duck period. That's before he becomes president. He's been elected, but he hasn't assumed the office yet. I mean, people lost their homes, businesses, and banks were being closed. Factories were shutting down their doors. Roosevelt and his advisors, who the press labeled the Brain Trust, spent their time preparing to fight the Depression. Now, what was their goal? Their goal was to fight the Depression and return prosperity. But what's the reality? The reality is these guys had no coherent vision of how they were going to combat the Depression. His advisors were deeply divided. How much should business be involved? How much should government be involved? I mean, it's a pretty complex issue. About the only thing they could agree on was the origins and the dynamics rooted in the economy, and aggressive federal action was needed to fight the Depression. Once again, this is the first time the government's really gotten directly involved, because it was a huge depression. Alright, ready to go to the next slide? And once again, if you're not, remember to press pause. Now, there was a severe banking crisis. You had banks closing and leaving depositors penniless. Indeed, by March of 1933, the banking system was ready for collapse. Public confidence in banks caused a growing number of runs on banks as depositors demanded their money. And what's a run on a bank? Well, if you guys have ever seen It's a Wonderful Life, usually they show it at Christmas time, old movie, but when he's in the bank and people come running in and demanding their money, and the bank doesn't have their money, that's kind of what a run on a bank is. And on his inauguration, basically Roosevelt assured the people that they had nothing to fear but fear itself, and assured everybody the economy was sound, and he intended to ask Congress for sweeping powers in order to deal with the crisis. Alright, ready to go to the next one? Basically, on March 6th, he announced a bank holiday, closing all the nation's banks. And 3 days later, Roosevelt asked for passage of the Emergency Banking Act. Basically, he took a draft from a Hoover proposal, and the act allowed the Federal Reserve to examine banks and certify those that were sound. And it also allowed the Federal Reserve to support the nation's banks by providing funds and buying stocks in preferred banks. And on Sunday, March 12th, Roosevelt began his fireside chats. Basically, this was over the radio, where Roosevelt's soothing and confident voice would reassure Americans, telling them that the banks would be safe again. And did the people believe it? Well, 60 million Americans returned their money to the banks. And within a month, almost 75% of the banks were open again. Little bit of coffee. Getting ready to go to the next slide. So now Roosevelt's going to try and fix what he believes is wrong with the economy. And basically his focus are on the 3 R's: reform, recovery, and relief. Basically his focus on abuses in the Stock Market Banking Act of 1933 reorganized the banking and financial system and created the Federal Deposit Insurance Program that provided federal insurance for the accounts of less than $3,000. Now it's $100,000. It might even be more now. Basically what that means, if you go to your bank and it has a little FDIC thing in the window, your bank closes, the government will give you up to $100,000 of the money that you have in that bank. Because the government said this is a certified bank, according to us. Also, reforms for the stock market incurred the Federal Securities Act in May of 1933 that required companies to provide information about their economic condition. The Security and Exchange Commission regulated stock market activities and set margin rates. And he began the repeal of prohibition by passing the Beer and Wine Act, which allowed the manufacture and sale of 3.2% wine and beer. That level of alcohol in beer, it's called near beer. And for a long time in Oklahoma, that was, you could only buy near beer. And later that year, the 21st Amendment repealing prohibition was passed. All right, getting ready to go to the next slide. Seeking agricultural recovery. Okay, the Farmers Holiday Association threatened to call a farmer strike unless Congress acted to restore profits. Basically, they were demanding what is known as parity. What's parity? It's the value of something compared to its market value. So recovery, not relief, was the goal in agriculture. And Henry A. Wallace, the Secretary of Agriculture, believed that the federal government needed to be involved in farm aid. So the Agricultural Adjustment Act was passed on May 12th. Central to the plan was the Domestic Allotment Plan, which worked on overproduction by paying farmers not to grow items. And I know that sounds crazy, but they still do it today because it cuts down on overproduction. Basically, they set up a national planning board that set out allocations on a list of products, and state boards divided production cuts and compensated for lost crops and livestock. Now, how is this going to be paid? Well, basically, a tax on food processors was used to create the money for paying farmers not to plant crops. And as the AAA, or Agricultural Adjustment Act, was passed after sowing the fields, thousands of acres of crops had to be plowed under, and you had thousands of hogs and dairy cows that had to be killed, causing many who cared about the hungry to become kind of critical of the program. Also, guys, better get to the next slide. Well, hold on a second. All right, next slide. Basically, farmers were smart, and they basically took the least fertile land out of production. And it would cause some to throw out sharecroppers and tenant farmers in order to take lands out of production. And they would use the money that they got from the government to basically buy more fertilizer. So they were producing more, which kind of undercut the whole overproduction thing. This whole Agricultural Adjustment Act and subsidization basically put more than 3 million people off the farm, but now farming became a highly capitalized industry requiring large amounts of wealth in the form of money and property. But because the farmers tried to outfox the fox by doing the least productive lands out of use, utilizing more scientific methods of farming, basically Congress reacted to this threat of overproduction again by placing large taxes on cotton and tobacco crops to farmers that exceeded the quotas. So once again, the government is doing what the government does, using taxes to try to get people not to do it. They're not saying you can't grow more cotton. Oh, but by the way, if you grow more cotton, the price, the tax on that extra cotton is going to be so high, it's not really worth you doing it. Kind of like they dissuaded people from smoking by placing a large tax on it. And by the way, it's worked. Basically, the Commodity Credit Corporation lent money to farmers based on the price of a crop, and if the crop price rose, the farmers could repay and make a profit. If the crop price, however, dropped, the government would come in and take the crop, and the farmer could take out another loan next year. And by 1935, recovery in the agricultural sector was underway. You had farm prices rising and purchasing power going up, but a setback came as the Supreme Court declared the AAA unconstitutional in Butler v. the United States, where it ruled that a government could not set quotas and specific taxes were illegal. And we'll get more into that case in just a little bit. So guys, as it was a program that was working and they shut the front door, if you can't go in through the front door, you got to go into the back door. And that's the next slide. And that's what Roosevelt did. Basically, he started the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act that pushed through and allowed the Soil Conservation Service to pay farmers for cutting back on soil depleting crops like cotton, tobacco, and wheat, and adapting conservation methods. And as that was kind of a stopgap measure, it then approved a second Agricultural Adjustment Act, which reestablished the commodity quota system. Now guys, it was drought and government policies together that helped take the land out of production. It stabilized farm prices and basically saved the farms. I mean, from 1932 to 1939, farm income doubled, but of course more than $4.5 billion in aid was given to the farmers. Basically, Roosevelt's policies of entitlements were accepted and seen as solutions, but it established a stable agricultural prices, even though here in America we have higher agricultural prices than anywhere else in the world, especially in sugar. What does this mean? Well, this means if you're, there's a Texas candy company called Atkinson's. They make the Chick-A Sticks. I don't know if you guys have had them, but they kind of cost a lot of money. You also have Lucas, which is that Mexican candy that you can get for like pennies on the dollar. Why? Because sugar isn't a commodity that's supported by the government in America, so its price is very cheap. So the candy can be incredibly cheap. And basically, even though this gave us stable agricultural prices, it set the established entitlements and forever changed the relationship between the farmers and government. Okay, ready to go to the next slide? Okay, so this is where Roosevelt is starting to get into trying to fix what's going on with our industry. Because we had banking and agricultural fixed, so he turns to industry, and here, of course, everyone is pulling in totally different directions. They pass a massive public works program with setting a 30-hour work week called the National Industrial Recovery Act, or the NIRA, on May 13th, 1933. Now, it was basically made of two parts. The first was the Public Works Administration that was paid $1.3 billion to put people back to work, and the National Recovery Administration that provided programs to restart the nation's industry and create jobs. They put General Hugh Old Iron Pants Johnson in charge of it, who had headed the War Industries Board during World War I. Their motto was, "We do our part," and massive public support grew for it. Basically, labor codes get reinstated and outlawed things like child labor and established child labor laws and allowed workers to organize in unions and to bargain collectively. Now, guys, why do you think they outlawed child labor? Well, the reason why they outlawed child labor is because adults needed the jobs, and adults were the ones that would support the families. All right, getting ready to go to the next slide. And as you can guess, not everybody was a huge fan of it. Critics called it the national runaround. Basically, it established low wages that were often ignored, and especially code wages for blacks and women. And consumers lost faith in NRA goods when the NRA generated price increases. So you had problems arising about price fixing, which is the artificial setting of commodity prices. And on May 27th, 1935, the Supreme Court hears the case of Schechter Poultry Corporation v. the United States, also known as the Sick Chicken case. Basically, Schechter Poultry was a business that only did business in New York State. It didn't go to any other states surrounding it. So basically, they argued that the federal government, because the federal government can only see interstate commerce or regulate interstate commerce, not intrastate commerce, that basically them forcing all these codes were illegal. And the Supreme Court ruled that the federal government had no authority to set national codes or wages and hours for companies that were not engaged in interstate commerce. right. Getting ready to go to the next slide. The TVA and the REA. What's the TVA? Well, that's the Tennessee Valley Authority. Basically, the Tennessee River ran through some of the most economically devastated areas in the nation. Oh, and by the way, it still does. The area needed flood controls, and if you built dams, you had the possibility of river navigation and hydroelectric power if you could control the river. So the project built or refurbished more than 25 dams and made hundreds of miles of river and lake systems become navigable. Now, what's the big deal about that? Well, it gave new jobs, but more importantly, it gave regional planning and economic revitalization. In other words, people can do things there. Now you can open a hotel along the Tennessee River. And people can go boating on it. And you're going to need people like fishing gear and stuff like that. Not only that, but with the hydroelectric power, now that you have hydroelectric power, people are getting electricity, meaning they're going to need electric stoves, they're going to need electric heaters, they're going to need electric pumps to get the water out of wells. And guys, if you have people that are buying those things, you're going to need people that can repair those things. So opportunity creates opportunity, creates opportunity. Now you also had the REA, or the Rural Electrification Program, that basically took electricity out to rural areas. Why was it needed? Well, in 1933, only 2% of homes had electrification. But 12 years later, 75% of the homes in America were electrified. And I mean, that's basically one of the reasons why Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, was so popular here in Texas, is because he worked hard to get rural electrification for the hill country, where you'd see women in their 30s that would have hunched over backs terrible, because basically they were lifting out 40-pound bales of water from wells, possibly as deep as 100 feet, and taking them up to the house because they didn't have electric pumps. So this provided huge liberation for people living out in rural areas. And once again, also created more opportunity, because now you need the people that are selling those things, the people that are fixing those things, etc. All right, getting ready to go to the next slide. Remembering the Forgotten Man. Now, something that was very near and dear to Roosevelt was the Forgotten Man. Who was the Forgotten Man? Basically, it was the men and women who faced unemployment and poverty. In March of 1933, employment was at an all-time high of 23%, more than 12 million. And in some states like New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Illinois, it was as high as 33%. So federal responsibility had to be taken. And kind of inspired by something he did when he was governor of New York, where he got men that were between 18 and 25 to basically come and do nature works. He started the Civilian Conservation Corps, which established more than 2,630 style army camps to house and give a good environment to urban males from 18 to 25. It enrolled more than 300,000 people, or men, because women weren't a part of this. Basically, it paid them $30 a month, even though $25 of it had to go back to the home. It improved the national park system. It cut out roads, fire breaks, telephone poles, irrigation ditches, planted trees and developing. In San Antonio, you had items like the Sunken Gardens Theater and the Japanese Tea Gardens that were constructed during this program. Here in Dallas, White Rock Lake, a lot of the recreational things around White Rock Lake were created by the Civilian Conservation Corps. Indeed, that would have been what your second paper was about. Now, why was this program for men only? Well, because this was at a day and a time when men were usually the main source of support for the family unit. Now, why were the ages of from 18 to 25 so important? Well, guys, the reason, if you don't give a young man from 18 to 25 something to do, they're going to find something to do, and usually it's not something that's really good for society. So take care of those. Also, they tried to get, they recruited blacks into the program as well as whites. And at first, the camps were desegregated. But then a lot of people from the surrounding communities didn't kind of like that, and so they did become segregated. Now, you also had the Public Works Association, or the PWA, that gave out more than $500 million to give to the states. Henry Hopkins was the head of this, and he found out that some states didn't make very good use of their money. An example of this was Oregon gave their money only to the able-bodied and thought that the feeble-minded and elderly should instead be chloroformed to death. The homeless were fed and cared for in transient camps. Basically, it paid 45 cents to unskilled labor, $1.10 to skilled labor a day. Brownsville, for example, used their money to hire Mexican Americans to plant palm trees along their main street, as well as to paint some Protestant churches. Now, you also had the Civil Works Administration that gave out more than 4 million immediate jobs. Now, there were a wide variety of them, like paid 30 to 50 cents a day for unskilled labor, $1 to $1.20 for skilled labor. They built more than 500,000 miles of roads and 40,000 schools. Now, at those schools, they also paid for the school teachers. And in Texas, we spent the money to build and beautify school grounds. All right, getting ready to go to the next slide. You also have the National Housing Act that created the Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA, that provided federally backed loans for mortgages and repairs. Now, why are homes so important to getting the economy? What's the tie-in there? Well, guys, if you own your own home and something breaks, you're going to have to fix it. Not only that, but to keep up the market value of your home, you're going to have to take care of your house. You're going to have to paint it. You're going to have to mow the grass. You're going to have to do landscaping, all of which costs money, which goes back into the local economy. And of course, also, it's an investment that increases your wealth. We ready to go to the next slide? Okay. The second 100 days. All right, guys, we talked about the first 100 days where he got all these programs started. Now he's going to have to fight to either keep them or to expand them. And as you can guess, some people don't like it. You always have threats from the other political party. And threats from the right included, like, by mid-1933, Republicans were actively opposing New Deal legislation. There were huge increases in government spending combined with a socialist threat to free enterprise. Indeed, when Roosevelt took us off the gold standard in April of 1933, and in 1934 nationalized gold deposits, basically he created baloney dollars because it so devalued the dollar from being worth $1 to being now only worth 59 cents. Hearst newspapers began to call Roosevelt's plan a raw deal that would soak the successful. And they joined forces with leaders of the American business and formed the American Liberty League. Yay! We're going to fight this guy. Y'all ready to go to the next slide? Okay. Now, like I told you, you always expect it from the other side. But what sometimes you don't expect is when it's coming from your own party. He had threats from the left, like Father Charles Coughlin, who was a Roman Catholic priest who used the radio to reach more than 30 million Americans. And he would use his time to lash out at all who didn't give relief to those in need. And as you can guess, he really hit hard against Hoover. And at first, back in 1933, he supported Roosevelt, but by 1934, even Roosevelt wasn't going far enough. He formed the National Union for Social Justice, also known as the People's Lobby, that helped politicians who would help him out, and advocated a federally guaranteed national income, the redistribution of wealth, tougher anti-monopoly laws, and nationalization of the banking system. And within a year, he had more than 5 million members. The next guy was Dr. Francis Townsend, who was a 70-year-old man who was inspired when he saw 3 old ladies searching through the garbage for food. And guys, he knew something had to be done about the elderly in our society. They were denied work relief because of their age. Most of them didn't own property. He wanted an old age pension plan that would pay $200 a month. How are we going to pay for it? Well, basically, he proposed that we put a national sales tax of 2% to support this thing. Thousands of clubs actually joined him in support, and they probably numbered several million, including 60 members of Congress. Now, isolated, these guys aren't really a threat, but then comes along a guy who can join all of them together. And we're going to talk about him on the next slide. Y'all ready? Here we go. Who's the guy that could join them all together? Why, it's Huey Long, also known as the Kingfish. He was a Democratic senator from Louisiana, the Democratic governor. His large frame and his flaming red hair almost matched his flamboyance and charisma. He was huge into social reforms. I mean, he built roads, bridges, hospitals, schools where they'd never been before. This, of course, created a lot of jobs and made him popular with a lot of people because basically he was helping them out. Now, of course, how did he get his name, the nickname, the Kingfish? Well, if you've ever seen a kingfish hunt, basically it skims along the top of the water and reaches down and grabs its bite. And guys, that's basically what Huey Long would do on these government projects. Basically, he got his kickbacks. Indeed, in 1929, he was impeached on charges of bribery and misappropriation of funds, even though the case was dropped. He was known for his grandiose oratory style. His flamboyant style helped him achieve stunning popularity. He was elected senator in 1930, handpicked his successor to the governor's office. He broke with the New Deal in 1930. He broke with the New Deal in 1934, stating that it didn't go far enough. He started up the Share Our Wealth Society, where he wanted all wealth at more than $1 million and inheritances over $5 million would be taxed and confiscated by the government. This, he argued, would give every family about $2,000 annually. Now, guys, I hate to tell you this, but plans like this don't work. Oh, and he knew it wouldn't work. But he said that when the American public was able to figure that out, I'll have something new for him. And as you can guess, his Share Our Wealth Society had more than 4 million members in 1935. And Roosevelt feared that Long might join up with Coughlin and Dr. Townsend to form a third party. But on June 21st, 1935, the Kingfish was assassinated. Supposedly by a guy named Carl Weiss, but the bullets that actually killed the Kingfish came from his bodyguards, not from Carl Weiss when they were having the shootout. Okay. You guys ready to go to the next slide? Okay. A shift in focus. Now, Roosevelt felt he had to take action against these new populist threats that were rising up, so he changed his focus from business to giving relief directly to people. He knew he needed more work relief, so Congress allocated $5 billion to be divided among the CCC, the PWA, the FERA, and a new program called the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA. Roosevelt wanted to provide as many jobs as possible. Now, the wages varied from about $13 in the North to $12. And between 1935 to 1938, the WPA hired more than 2.1 million people doing manual labor, like building roads, schools, public building. Getting ready to go to the next slide. And in an Arts for the Millions program, it hired writers, composers, photographers, musicians, historians, and others. And by 1939, an estimated 30 million people had seen WPA plays, paintings, because they also had mural programs reflecting the positive in the common man that created more than 2,500 murals and 100,000 paintings. And the WPA also made efforts to help out women, minorities, young adults, and students. Between 300 and 400,000 women were employed each year. And basically it worked to ensure that African American employment in the northern states was there. However, there were some difficulties in the South where they still had to deal with segregated work camps. In Texas, basically blacks were told that the camps were for whites only, which led to Texas having the smallest percentage of blacks in the WPA. Getting ready to go to the next slide. Social Security Act. Basically, the Social Security Act was to be a permanent modification of the government's role in society. Only 15% of the workers in America were covered by pension plans. And so this basically was going to be for retirees 65 or older, which of course worried conservatives that they thought it would remove people's willingness to work. Basically, these pensioners were to receive $10 to $85 a month. And the more a worker had paid into the system, the larger his share would be. The Federal Insurance Contribution Act, or FICA, our friend FICA, for any of you guys that have a job out in the private sector, you see FICA on every paycheck. This was a new tax, basically, that was created to cover the cost. But, guys, if you think about it, the first people that actually received Social Security never paid anything into it. And that's kind of the way it still is today, in that all your FICA money that's being taken out is being spent on the people that are on Social Security now, with the understanding that when you get older, they're going to do the same for you. The problem with that is that now there are less young people working to support the older people that there are more of. So it's a crazy problem. And also, probably most controversial, was that this act established federal offices at the state level. Next, you also have the National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act, that strengthened unions by putting the power of the government behind the workers' rights to organize. And by 1936, union contributions to the Democratic Party were the largest group of donors. And they still donate heavily and support the Democratic Party. The Revenue Act, basically because of the new graduated income tax that Roosevelt had passed from 1933 to 1979. That's where supposedly you tax people that make more money higher than you tax the people that make less money. That's a graduated income tax. But the wealthiest 1% actually increased their wealth 2.3%. So now the wealthiest 1% are controlling 30% of the nation's wealth. Getting ready to go to the next slide. The New Deal and Society. Ready to go to the next slide. The New Deal in urban America. Basically, during this time, you had more people moving to the cities, which of course created more problems, or new problems. The resources were too few to take care of the expanding cities as well as their poor. From 1929 to 1933, property values declined 18%. Now, what is that going to do? Well, that's going to undermine your property taxes. Well, guys, I guess the city would be worried if everybody was paying their property taxes. But during this time, most people couldn't afford it. Indeed, in 33 of 145 of the largest cities in America collect only 75% of their property taxes because the people just can't pay it. So to save money, cities cut wages, laid off people like policemen, firemen, teachers. Some cities issued their own paper money to pay wages, so that basically the people would spend that money in the city. Because like every time, even if I come out here and I buy a refill at RaceTrac for $1. I've just increased the wealth of the city by $1. I mean, why do you guys, if you've ever gone to one of those car washes where you wash the car yourself, you put in your dollar, they give you the tokens, but those tokens are only for that car wash. Why do they do that? So that you'll come back. Because usually you'll have 1 or 2 or 3 spare tokens left over. In Houston, banks who lent the city money demanded people in certain positions or be able to decide which programs should be cut and by how much. Now, due to this, however, there was completion of huge projects like the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco and Boulder Dam. All right, getting ready to go to the next slide. Popular culture. Radio and films provided an escape. In the films, you had big classics like Gone with the Wind, Wizard of Oz, huge musical numbers like Top Hat and Broadway Melody that allowed people to escape daily life. Also during this time, romantic comedies were really popular, where you'd have a rich guy or a rich girl falling in love with a poor guy or a poor girl. And if you've ever seen the movie Pretty Woman, you know we still have stuff like that going about. Gangster films were also real popular during this time, but there was a big change in the genre. In the 1920s, the big stars were the gangsters, but during the Depression era, the big stars became the cops, struggling bravely to save the world. Because now people have less, what little they have is very important to them. And guys, where are we today? How do they display it? I don't know. Watch Law and Order? I don't know. Also during this time, you had Hollywood installing production codes, which set a standard to keep immoral or indecent material out of movies. And the movies in this time generally stressed uplifting themes like honesty and courage. Getting ready to go to our next slide. Radio. Radios were even more popular. I mean, 90% of the households had a radio. Amos and Andy show was the most popular. Even though you had new comedians like the Marx Brothers, George Burns and Gracie Allen, Jack Benny coming up. You had singers like Al Jolson and Bing Crosby. And if you've seen American Idol, well, that show needs to move over. Because back in 1934, the radio had the original amateur hour, where ordinary people could become stars. Now in 1937, quiz shows became popular, as well as stories like The Lone Ranger, Dick Tracy, and The Shadow. But the largest show that displayed the power of radio came on Halloween night, 1938, with Orson Welles and his Mercury Theater on the air. They're playing a War of the Worlds. Basically, it was, a book by H.G. Wells about an alien invasion, but they started the show with just like instrumental music, sounding like an orchestra was playing. And then all of a sudden they broke into the orchestra. We have a special news flash. In New Jersey, and people didn't know that it was fake. They started freaking out. You had people, crashing their cars, shooting at things. And the next day, basically, it was revealed, hey, sorry, kind of made Orson Welles nationally famous. And the main thrust of popular culture during this time was to show the goodness behind democracies and what they stood for. Okay, getting ready to go to the next slide. A New Deal for minorities and women. Basically, Eleanor Roosevelt was the first truly active First Lady who crisscrossed the country listening to like coal miners, waitresses, farmers, housewives, and so on. And she gave the hope and explained the benefits of the New Deal to everybody she met. She labored to ensure that women received a fair deal. So she held like news conferences and press conferences just for female reporters. Now, what's the reality? Well, basically, NRA codes maintain lower wages for women, and waitresses and agricultural or domestic workers weren't covered by Social Security, nor did they get a minimum wage. And they made up about 10% of the WPA workforce. Well, what about African Americans? Well, by 1938, 30% of African Americans were on some form of federal relief, and they began leaving the Republican Party in droves and joining the Democratic Party. Now, once again, guys, why did they used to be Republicans? Why did they achieve national office and state and local offices under the Republican Party? Well, that was the party of Abraham Lincoln. But now that the Democrats are providing jobs, they're going over and crossing party lines. But discrimination made it difficult for skilled laborers to get more than unskilled public work. And jobs for low-income housing would be changed to segregated middle-income housing instead. Getting ready to go to the next slide. And in 1939, when the Daughters of the American Revolution don't allow world-renowned black opera singer Miriam Anderson to sing at their concert hall, once again because of segregation, Eleanor Roosevelt resigns her membership and arranges for a public performance to be held at the Lincoln Memorial that was attended by more than 75,000 people. Okay. Getting ready to go to the next slide. What about Latino Americans? Well, for example, in San Antonio, 30% of the African Americans and 29% of Mexican Americans were on relief. The WPA and the PWA would usually pay more than they would receive in the private sector, like $8.54 a week versus $6.02 a week or less. And in 1934 to 35, the San Antonio's pecan shellers went on strike, led by union organizer Red Emma Tacuna, as workers were working 54-hour weeks for $3 to $4. And by 1938, they won. Basically, they got a higher wage. And she's kind of becoming a popular person to talk about. Everybody ready for the next slide? This is about my peeps, yo. For Native Americans. Basically, the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 returned land and community control to tribal organizers and provided for Indian self-rule on the reservations. Uh-oh, getting ready to lose my battery. Okay. So now we're starting to have Indian self-rule on their reservations. Now that we're all charged up again. Ready to go to the next slide? Failures of the New Deal. Roosevelt and the Supreme Court. Okay, basically on Black Monday, which was May 27th, 1935, the Supreme Court heard the case of Schechter v. the United States. The sick chicken case I told you all about. The court unanimously ruled that the National Industrial Recovery Act represented an unconstitutional delegation of power to the executive branch. It ruled that the NRA regulated commerce within states, whereas the Constitution limited federal regulation to interstate commerce. Angrily, Roosevelt claimed that the court's narrow interpretation would return the Constitution to the horse and buggy definition of interstate commerce. Now, of course, the Supreme Court had also struck down the Agricultural Adjustment Act, a Soil Conservation Act, New York State's minimum wage, declaring them all unconstitutional. Not only that, but the Wagner Act, the TVA, and Social Security were coming up on appeal near the election of 1936. So just 2 weeks after winning the election, Roosevelt came up with an idea of how to combat the Supreme Court. As most of the justices were over 70 years old, he argued that they had to work too hard, and he proposed the addition of adding one new judge for each one currently sitting on the bench. Now, because the president, of course, gets to pick the Supreme Court justices, it would allow Roosevelt to pack the court with people that would support his idea. And as you can see, this would have been a constitutional problem, but it didn't become a major issue when 8 of the Supreme Court justices resigned, allowing him to put in new admissions, which Chicago journalists called a switch in time that saved 9. In other words, we don't get 9 new justices. Ready for the next slide? A resurgence of labor. Union organizers found out that it was useful to tell workers that President Roosevelt wanted them to unionize, as he had passed so much legislation that had been favorable to unions. And in 1934, you had 1,800 strikes involving 1.5 million workers. And in 1935, during a national strike, the Committee for Industrial Organizations was formed, or the CIO. It began basically a push, excuse me, into new areas of labor like rubber, automobile, and electrical industries. And in 1936, a new kind of strike was developed called the sit-down strike. At an Akron, Ohio rubber industry, where basically instead of going outside the building and picketing, what you do is you would go inside the building and then just sit down where you were, not do your work. That way it will be tough for the employer to get you out and to get the non-union people or scabs to come in and replace you. And after the first sit-down strike, the results were so successful that they formed the United Automobiles Workers and began a sit-down strike of General Motors. Now, why'd they do this? Well, GM had laid off almost half of all of its workers from 435,000 to only 244,000. It had dropped wages from $33 down to only $20. And it spent about $72,000 in union busting activities in 1935. So workers in Flint, Michigan, on November 30th, 1936, began their sit-down strike in the factory. Now GM, they tried to do it the easy way. They shut off the heat. Oh, and by the way, just so you know, it was only 16 degrees outside. And they do this to try to break the workers, but they're unable to dislodge them. So by January 11th, 1937, they try to move in with police armed with guns, clubs, and tear gas. The strikers fight back, however, with fire hoses and homemade slingshots that fired 2-pound door hinges. The police become frustrated, start to fire shots, wounding 14 workers, compared to the 37 cops that were wounded. But the strikers hold on. GM asks the governor to pull out the National Guard, and he refuses. And finally, GM had to settle with the workers. I'm going to go to the next slide. Oh. That's where a lot of what I just told you is. But as I was saying, this kind of strike was so effective that U.S. Steel gave in without even a fight when the steelworkers, the Steelworkers Union, threatened that they'd do a sit-down strike. And by 1937, 4,700 strikes took place where the unions won 80% of the time. Union membership soared. What? Union membership soared. And Time magazine stated that sitting down has replaced baseball as a national pastime. Getting ready to go to the next slide. Now, some of the strikes, however, turned violent. For example, in Chicago, where at a Memorial Day parade in 1937, a rally of workers and their families was attacked with 10 killed, 90 wounded, 67 arrested. They begin to state basically that union workers are communists. But the unions became so powerful that by 1938 they became highly politicized and joined together with the CIO. So that's why you have the AFL-CIO today. Ready for the next slide? The end of New Deal legislation. A little sip of coffee. Well, guys, Congress, led by Southern Democrats and Midwestern Republicans, blocked or impeded social legislation. For example, the National Housing Act of 1937 and the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. Now, why were they doing this? Because basically Congress feared the centralized executive management of power that was reducing congressional power. So they blocked these things and they said, hey, we got to end these programs. And basically Roosevelt agreed and immediately cuts back on nearly 1.5 million jobs. causing unemployment to immediately soar to 19%. This is called the Roosevelt recession. Well, of course, the congressmen freak out because now unemployment's back. So they put the programs back into place, and some but not all were rehired. And in June of 1938, the Fair Labor Standard Act was passed, setting the maximum work week of 44 hours, a minimum wage of 25 cents an hour, and outlawed child labor. And by 1939, the economy had finally reached the point where it was 10 years before, in 1929. Ready for the next one? However, the big deal is now basically 3.3 million people were working for the government. So the New Deal's impact, basically it failed to achieve full economic recovery. Millions were still unemployed. Now the relationship between the government and the people is totally altered. I mean, before this period, the federal government barely touched the lives of most Americans. But afterwards, it becomes a part of everybody's daily life. Well, wait a minute, Professor Galloway, if Roosevelt's New Deal didn't end the Depression, what did? Basically World War II. And that's what we'll be getting into next lecture.